Hey everybody, this is Alex Merced from alexmercedcoder.com. And what I want to talk about today is just kind of like some approaches to like organizing your JavaScript code. Really, you could take these principles to any language. Just some of the tools you might use in doing so will be different. I'll kind of like talk about that as we go. But bottom line is the reason why like conventions and code organization and comments and documentation are important is because other people will likely, especially if you're working professionally as a developer, other people are going to look at your code and they're going to add to that code, update that code. And if they can't understand what you wrote because you didn't give them enough breadcrumbs to understand what's going on, well, that's going to make it really hard for them to do that, because it doesn't matter how good you are at as a developer. When you look at someone else's code, you're not a mind reader. Okay, so if I'm creating like a function that adds two numbers and I call it like, I say, hey, function Steve, it takes Bob and John and then returns Bob plus John. Okay, this is literally just a function that takes in two numbers and returns the result of those two numbers. But if you look at this, you'd be really confused. It's like, what's all this Steve, Bob, and John stuff? Because these are not semantic. Semantic meaning we're using words that convey meaning. Okay, so what would have been a better, like, chances are we would want to name the function something that reflects what it's doing. So what is it doing? It's going to give me the sum of two numbers. Okay, so we can say like add two nums. That's pretty clear what this function does. It adds two numbers. And generally the idea is you always expect that by the name you should be able to tell what it returns. So add two nums, I would expect that it returns the sum of two nums. So that means the two arguments really should probably be called like num1 and num2, because it's receiving two numbers. So we're returning num1 plus num2. Okay, and I don't actually have to write any comments for this function. This function, just by looking at it, probably most developers can look at it and pretty obvious what it's doing, why it's called what it's called. Much easier to understand like what was my intention. But it still doesn't hurt for me to like add like a line just saying, takes two numbers, returns sum. Okay, so this way when I go back, if I need to edit this function, I still know sort of like what is going in, because that's always the thing. When you're writing a function, these functions oftentimes work with each other. So like the result of one function gets fed into another function. So if you just change a function and change what it returns, you might break how other functions work in the grander scheme of things. So always the important thing to know, so that way what's going on inside doesn't affect what goes on outside, is always having a clear idea of what's supposed to go in and what is supposed to come out, and sticking to that. You'll often hear the term contract, meaning just like, hey, I wrote this function with expecting this going in and expecting this going out, and you stick to that story, because chances are the rest of your application and all the functions and pieces were built with that piece doing that. Okay, you can change how you get from point A to point B, but you got to make sure you keep point A and point B consistent, meaning the same inputs with the same outputs. Okay, and this is where like typing and TypeScript becomes really useful, because you can like hard code those in there. You can be like, this is what goes in, this is what comes out. If I do anything else, tell me I'm wrong. And that's always really cool. But here's the thing: you might be using lots of libraries and lots of external things that might end up using the same names. So what if I download some library that has a function built into it that's called add two nums? Okay, these are referred to as like namespace collisions. Okay, like name meaning just like the name of a thing, collisions meaning, hey, you have two things kind of competing over the same name. A good way to kind of avoid this is to always kind of bundle the things that you create for your application in what's called a namespace. The idea of a namespace just means like you're giving it some sort of prefix. Okay, so I might call it like my app. So I'll create a variable called const my app. And what this is going to be is an object. And generally, like any variables, any functions, anything that I need to declare for this app, I might store in here. You might have multiple objects, one for like just variables, another one for like functions. The idea is that you group that data, and I can still have add two nums in here, which is going to equal a function that takes in again num1 and num2 and returns num1 plus num2 using like arrow function notation just to save us some keystrokes. Oops, let me go back to that file. Okay, and then I can still use this, except now I'm going to use this as my app.add2nums. Okay, and I can just be like 1, 2. So that still is fine. Okay, but by providing it, by putting all this stuff under this like my app namespace, um, it's an object. But the idea is that we're saying that we're giving it, it's still called add two nums, but it won't collide with a standalone function called add two nums that I may get from some library, because it's all bundled under the my app name. So sometimes it's useful to just group things in namespaces for that purpose. And also sometimes you can create namespaces. And again, in JavaScript, it really just means like create an object and bundle things in objects. In other languages like C# and C, Java and whatnot, you actually have a formal feature called a namespace, where you can actually say, hey, like anything defined within these brackets are part of, my app, and you have to do like my app dot that thing. It's the same result, just a different name, slightly different way of executing it. But when people talk about namespaces, this is what they're talking about. They're just saying, hey, bundling your functions and variables under sort of a shared name. So that way it doesn't collide with other existing variables and whatnot. Okay? So, I mean, I could have something like, you know, depending on if you have a group of functions that serve a particular purpose, group them under like a namespace that reflects that. So that's easy to kind of tell, okay, these functions are used for this, like random dot or something like that. Cool. Okay. But again, also still doesn't hurt to use comments. So I could sit here and say, hey, like this is, namespace for application variables and functions. And so that way they can understand, why do I have this my app object? Then just be like, here, function takes two numbers and returns sum. And notice that my comments aren't super huge long. Like I'm not writing like paragraphs of stuff, but a line that really kind of sums up what's going on in the next line. Okay, so that way someone else comes in here, they can kind of pretty quickly kind of see, okay, hey, like this is my app object, and this is we're just using this as kind of a namespace to group these things. And in there's a function called add two nums, which takes two numbers and returns a sum. And knowing what the code is supposed to achieve, it makes it a lot easier for me to read, because I can have that in mind as I try to read it and understand what the code is doing. And that's all good. What I personally like, I like separation of concerns. So like I might create multiple namespaces. So like my case, let's say const myfunc myfunc state. So all like my more like stateful type variables, things that change fairly regularly, might be under one namespace. And then I like to put these like little like banners in my code. Just makes it easier for me to like flip through the code and find like specific things I'm looking for. So I can be like state. And again, state are just variables that change, that then in effect alter the way your application behaves. In the same way that like if your inner state, like your happiness becomes sadness, the way you behave is different. You're still the same person, but you're behaving differently because your state has changed. Then we have my functions, all these things that I can do things with. So actually, I would want to call this like my app state. We'll call this like functions const my app functions. And this can sometimes end up making things a little bit more verbose. So a lot of people are thinking, was like, then I have to write my app functions dot the function's name, and that might get tedious. It may. So again, you don't necessarily need to wrap everything in a namespace, but the idea is, if you think you want to use names that are very likely to be used in something else you're using, this is a good way to kind of be able to still use those names. I can still call like something called like add two nums, or call something like render, whatnot, without creating these kind of collisions. And then again, I'm organizing my code. So like I know, like just by based on these headings, I know like, okay, if I need to declare like a new variable or declare a new function, I can put them in the right namespace, and I have a part of my code that's easy for me to refer to. That's nice organizing of the code. Okay, so if I'm like doing React, I might just, even within a React component, I will organize it this way, where I'll have like the section where I declare all my state, section where I might declare any helper functions in that component, a section where I might do any like use effects. I'll break it up and organize it so that way it's like it's easy for me to scroll and like know, okay, hey, this is what I need to look for right now. Well, anything like that's kind of in this section of the code. Okay, other things, again, when you think about the naming of your functions, using typical names like get, set, So usually, if you have a function that's going to get you a particular value, we call it like get. So let's pretend that, in our state, we have a value called age, which is 10. Okay. You can say, maybe we'll say, call it get next age. So that means it's going to, so get always means it's going to return you something. So whatever it's going to get, the thing it's going to get you should always be like the thing after the word get. So in this case, I'm going to say, hey, get your next age. So what are you going to be after your next birthday? Okay. And let me just get next age. And then this will just be a function that returns my app state dot age plus 1. Okay, and there we go. We have a function that returns your age after your next birthday, theoretically. Okay, now what if I wanted to set your age? So I might make a function called set age. Okay, and then this basically will just say, new age. So you pass in an argument that represents the new age, and then, my app state dot age now equals new age. But the great thing about this is that this is very clear what this does. This changes the set, always implies that you're changing the value of the thing you mention next. So in this case, I'm setting the age, or I'm getting the next age. Things like that. You might use other prefixes like set usually is used for like changing a thing. Remove if you're going to remove something. You'll notice that you'll see a lot of these as you read a lot of functions in a lot of libraries. But get and set are usually probably what you're going to see like the most, because oftentimes what you're doing is you're getting information and setting information. So using those prefixes can help make what the function's purpose really clear to other developers who are used to seeing functions named that way. Okay, but always again, don't just have a function that's called like dogs. Okay, because that doesn't tell you what I mean. Most people probably would think it's like some sort of constructor. If it's a thing, if you're creating a function that instantiates a new dog for you, then you might want to call that like create dog. So think about like what does your function do? And if your function is doing a lot of things where you can't think of just one word because hey, it's getting this and setting that, then you probably are doing too much in that function. You probably want to then break it up, all those little steps into their own functions, and then create like a wrapper function that does all the things. So like if you get this and set that, then create a function that gets this and sets that, and then create another function that does that whole thing as a procedure. Like you'll find that your code's it'll be a lot easier to read your code, and having smaller functions that do more focused things is going to be a lot easier to think through. Okay, just because the goal is to do X doesn't mean that one function has to do all of X. Think of what are the tasks that the function must do and then break it up and organize it. But yeah, so make sure your variable names are good, your function names, your variable names. Group things in the namespaces so you can avoid collisions. Use comments so that way people can understand what your code is doing. Also, what your own doing. I mean, if I don't put comments and I look at my code like a few days later, I'm gonna be like, what was I trying to do again? Why did I do this? And then when you try to edit your code, you end up creating more bugs because you forgot why you did certain things, and you start changing it and undoing things that you did for a reason. Okay, so make sure you always do that. Also documentation. Okay, so not only documentation doesn't only come in the form of comments, but of Markdown files, because Markdown files are readable on GitHub, and generally we're looking at each other's code on GitHub. So you would just make a Markdown file, so here like example.md, and learn how to write Markdown. It's pretty simple. Basically, a hash is like a title, so it'll be like hello. So like 2 hashes would be an H2, 3 hashes would be an H3, 4 hashes would be an H4, etc. But the cool thing about VS Code is I can right-click on this and I can open this in. Actually, I have to do open preview. There we go. And you can now see how it's previewed, like how that Markdown would look like in another tab. And if you want to see the way it would look like on GitHub, there is like a GitHub Markdown preview. So like MD preview. Which is the one I have installed? I think it's this one. No, not that one. I mean, I do have that installed, but that's not the one I'm looking for. This is one that's like GitHub Markdown preview. So there's different ways you can change like how the Markdown preview looks like. GitHub Markdown preview. I think this is it. Yep, here we go. Markdown preview GitHub styling. So what this will do is that when you preview Markdown files in VS Code, it'll use like the GitHub styling. So in this case, it's using like the GitHub like dark theme. But yeah, but again, Markdown is pretty easy to write. Like if I want to create a chart, it would just be like, column 1, column 2, again, there's several guides on Markdown. I have other videos where I go over Markdown. We can say, hey now, and if I go back to preview, see there's a chart now. Okay, so you can do pretty cool things. You can do links by just doing a square bracket saying text for the link, and then in the parentheses after it, you would put the actual URL, www.thisisalink.com, and you see there's the link. You can add a picture, which would just be the same pattern, except you put an exclamation point in front of it. So you put like some alt text in the square brackets, and then you put a link to the picture in the parentheses. Just make sure you have the exclamation in front of it. There, you're not gonna see anything right now because I didn't fill it in, but it makes it really easy to write documentation. So what you can do is just write down explanations, and if you want to write and then copy code snippets. Code snippets are your friend, which you can do with like using 3 backticks and then putting in like the suffix or like abbreviation for the language that you're writing it in. So now I can do is I can go back to my example.js and I can say, hey, let me take a look at this piece of code here. Put that in the backticks, and then I can explain it. I can be like, this code is for blah, blah, blah. And you see, like, I can see the snippet of the code, and this code is for blah, 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 blah. All these things are going to, one, help you organize your own code better so you understand what you're looking at. But also it's going to make it easier for you to work with other people so that way they know what your code is doing. And again, exactly how you execute this can be different in JavaScript. It can be different from language to language. So if you're working on a team, you want to like get together and agree on like what practices will you use, but you're generally going to want to use some practices similar to this. They may decide they want everything wrapped in a class. So instead, doing like this, you may do something like this where it's like class my app, and you just do everything that's like static properties. You might do like static age equals 10, and then do things like get age, and this would be static And the reason you do static so that way you don't have to instantiate. So I can actually, I can still just use it like this, like my app.getAge. Instead of having to instantiate a variable, use a new keyword. Okay, but the cool thing about this is that now you can like kind of reference itself. Okay, so I can just be like, return my app.age, static set age, return, my app.age equals new age. And simple. Basically, we're back to where we were before, except now we have it wrapped in a class using static properties and static methods. So that way you don't have to instantiate, or you could not make them static and then have to instantiate if there's a reason you'd want to have multiples of multiple instances in case maybe they have unique properties. But yeah, hopefully that all gives you some tips just kind of how to organize your code. Like what your code is going to do what it's going to do, but if you can organize it, it'll make it easier to maintain, like quite a bit. So my name is Alex Merced from alexmercedcoder.com. Have a great day and enjoy yourself.